Well, Professor Samuel Makinda is the Chair of Security, Terrorism and Counter-Terrorism Studies at Murdoch University in Perth. Professor Makinda serves on the Australian Foreign Minister's National Consultative Committee for International Security Issues. He's also worked as a consultant to the Kenyan government, and he's written extensively about security in Africa. Well, to talk about the situation in Somalia, Professor Makinda joins us from our Perth studio. Professor Makinda, thanks so much for your time this evening. Can you tell us more about Al-Shabab? Who are they?
Well, Al-Shabab is an organization that was formed about 5 or so years ago and is led mainly by non-Somalis. So although we often hear that Al-Shabab is a Somali organization, I would say that Al-Shabab is just based in Somalia, but it is run by people who have experience in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. So I would say, to a certain extent, it's a product of the intervention or the invasion of Iraq and the intervention in Afghanistan.
Professor, how is Al-Shabab viewed among the Somali population?
Al-Shabab is not very popular among the Somalis because it tends to impose on them rules and values that are alien to the Somalis. So it's not a very popular organization among the ordinary people in Somalia. And I would say that in the past few years, there has been a split in the organization between the foreigners who control the organization and the Somalis who believe they should be the ones in charge of the organization.
In regard to that, further to that, in regard to that split, a report in the Guardian newspaper has said that this attack has highlighted Al-Shabaab's weaknesses rather than saying anything about its strengths, because it does show that it is divided and in retreat. And the report also posed the question that whether the organisation, in its death throes, is going to drag Somalia into another dreadful round and dreadful cycle of violence. What do you think about that? How great is that risk?
Well, there's a risk, but I would say that the Guardian story is correct, but only partially correct. That the Al-Shabaab has been weakened by the efforts of the AMISOM, that's the African Union Force in Somalia, and also by the intervention by Kenyan forces, which went into Somalia, I think, in October last year. So it has been weakened considerably. But if you leave it that way, you give the impression that the problem is just limited there. I would say Al-Shabaab is operating largely because the international community has been unable to help Somalia organize itself. That the problem of terrorism in Africa is basically a governance problem. And unless we have an effective governance system, we are likely to have problems like that.
Before I ask you more about the international community's response from here on in regard to the Somali government itself, what does this attack say about the strength or indeed the weakness of the Somali government? How much further damage may this attack inflict upon the perception of how much control this government has, particularly outside of Mogadishu, if it can't control Mogadishu itself?
Well, Scott, you're right. The Somali government, the transitional federal government, has no control over the territory of Somalia. I don't think that that government has control over any part of Mogadishu. It is the African Union force that has driven Al-Shabaab outside Mogadishu. The Somali government that we have at the moment, which is called the transitional federal government, is only a government in name. It doesn't have the status of a normal government and therefore doesn't control anything. Whether the attack on Wednesday is going to weaken it or not, I think is beside the question, because this is a government that has never had any power within its own territory.
Professor, how much would have that been the motivation of al-Shabab to show in a very symbolic, very violent way that it can still reach right into the heart of the Somali capital as the Prime Minister is speaking and cause damage and kill some very influential Somali officials?
Well, I'm disappointed that that has happened, but I don't find it surprising. If you don't have an effective system of government, if you don't have a police force, if you don't have an intelligence organization, it is very difficult to prevent terrorists from operating the way they like. So al-Shabaab can move into Mogadishu and out of Mogadishu the way it likes.
Professor, to pick up on what you were saying earlier about what the international community should do, not just the neighbouring countries in the region, but the broader international community, what do you believe should be done to bring about a sense of stability and normalcy for the people of Somalia?
I believe the international community has the capability and the resources to resuscitate the Somali government, or the Somali state for that matter. It is a pity that with all the problems that we have seen there and with all the resources that we have in the world, that the international community has not had the political will to move into Somalia with force and establish a functioning government, establish functioning institutions, and establish a society that can operate the way we operate in most other countries. I would say the resources are there, the skills are there, but there's no political will. If, for instance, the international community treated the situation in Somalia the way they are treating the situation in Syria, I would say the Somali problem would go away. And not only al-Shabaab would go away, but also piracy would disappear. And I believe other countries in East Africa, especially Kenya, would have perhaps space to breathe or space to develop its own territory without fearing attacks from al-Shabaab every now and again.
Well, Professor, it's almost 20 years since those famous images of the American troops running up the beach there in Somalia. Why isn't that political will there? Given, as you point out, this is an international concern through side effects such as piracy, why, almost 20 years later, hasn't the political will been charged to bring about genuine and sustainable change there in Somalia?
I cannot fully answer that question. All I can say is that we have been let down by political leadership around the world, that our political leaders can argue convincingly they are sending military forces in the Indian Ocean to protect ships against piracy. And the amount of money they will use in those forces is far more than what they would use to create a government in Somalia. Yet they can't make efforts to establish a functioning political system. So I would say we have been let down by political leaders, not just in East Africa, not just in Africa, but around the world.
Professor Samuel Makinda from Murdoch University in Perth. Fascinating talking with you, and I thank you for your time this evening.
My pleasure.